Hi, everyone. My name is Rob Resnowski. I'm a professor in the Department of Theater. Welcome to Classes with Cal. This event was created by committee members of the College of Arts and Letters, the Culture of Care, the College of Arts and Letters Culture of Care Retirement Subcommittee. I'm a member of that. So are a couple of other panelists, people here. I'd like them to introduce themselves to talk about the committee's work for a second.
Hi, I'm Christine Radke. I work in our Alumni and Development Office in the College of Arts and Letters, and we're really excited to be able to present this to you today.
Susan's also here, Susan Bandis, and then Tom Lovick and Etta Abrams, who is not able to be with us today. Please note that the Q&A and chat features are on if you'd like to ask questions to our panelists. And I'd like to introduce Associate Dean of Academic Personnel and Administration and a Professor of German Studies in the College of Arts and Letters, Sonja Fritzsche.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Happy Saturday. And Rob Robnowski has just been introducing you to his wonderful committee on the Culture of Care Task Force that's been focusing specifically on retirement. I am so excited to welcome you on their behalf as well, and on behalf of the College of Arts and Letters to Classes with Cal. And this is a particularly exciting one for me to be able to participate in because I greatly admire the work that the subcommittee has doing. They have been working really hard to reimagine retirement in the college, and particularly how to help faculty with this transition from a career based in mentorship and stewardship that has been the focus and often in the latter years of the career, to envision what the next step will be in their path to intellectual leadership. And retirement holds so many opportunities that can include, and we hope, continued fruitful education connections with their department, the college and MSU, because there's so many wonderful things going on educationally, intellectually, and also events-wise under normal times at MSU. So it's a wonderful community to remain engaged with. Or retirement can also lead to completely different endeavor in the Lansing area, another state, or even another country. But we hope you can remain connected with us through events like this. And the virtual space allows us to do that. The same is true also of alumni. As graduate and undergraduate students, as you transition from your time at MSU to continue your careers in new and exciting ways. We're very excited to welcome alumni who are with us today. You also are, as you shift from MSU into your career, you're finding new ways to share the information that you have learned, and you're also excited to expand the opportunities of the others you are working with. Graduation is but one milestone on the path to the horizon that you have envisioned for yourself. One that is completely different and even more exciting and fulfilling often if you've taken a shift than the original one that you might have been embarking upon. As many of us find, we embark on several different careers as we go through life. And at the same time, there continue to remain many opportunities for mentorship here at MSU, in the college, in the departments, and stewardship of this institution, of the work of the college, and also of the home department where you were a student, where current students can benefit from your time and your wisdom and I'm talking both to alumni and retirees here. And the college also wants to continue to give back to you, and Classes with Cal is one such opportunity for us to continue to support what we believe should be lifelong education. Now, these are our relationship in normal times, and obviously we live in a time of much uncertainty at many levels. There are personal, physical, familial, financial, social, political uncertainties, just to name a few, that many of us are experiencing in different and intersecting ways. During COVID-19, the college, the faculty, students, and staff have really tried to continue to stay committed to our values that we formulated a couple of years ago. And these are equity, openness, and community. with diversity being an intentional matter of institutional habit in everything that we do. Student, faculty, and staff health and safety is a #1 priority for us in Cal and also in MSU. And this priority drives any decision that we have made and will make going forward. In the college, across faculty, staff, and students alike, we have endeavored to establish a culture of care, which this task force on retirement has been a part, or the subcommittee on retirement has been a part of. And the culture of care remains to be a part of our guiding principles for our values, mission, and vision. And we have not wavered from this since the pandemic. And we go to it more often now than ever. And COVID-19, of course, has brought with it financial strains for all of us, and MSU is no exception. To help guide us through the budgetary challenges that have accompanied the pandemic, the college developed a contingency planning document. This document was created with input from department chairs, program and center directors, as well as members of the faculty governance in the college, and with feedback from the broader faculty and staff. You can find out more information on this contingency planning document on the Cal website under About, where you can find information on the values and the whole culture of care process, and also the contingency planning document that includes information about the subsequent budget reduction task force that began in July and concluded at the end of October. All of the reports are there from this, and the whole endeavor was guided by the following priorities. Again, protecting and putting people first, enacting our commitment to equity, advancing our core academic mission, and leading transformative change at the same time. The college also continues to make student mental health a priority. We are very excited to have a faculty member, Jonathan Ritz, who is leading a new collaborative effort with counseling and psychiatric services to provide support to Cal students in need. Advisors are also working closely with students to monitor how and when students might need extra support. And as you can imagine, the financial need is great for many of them. The college has established an emergency fund that can help undergraduates and graduate students bridge over a difficult time. And we take donations on a continual basis, as there are always students in need too of emergency funds beyond COVID-19. To date, we have raised over $5,000. And you can make a donation to this fund by going to, if you Google the Arts and Letters Emergency Fund, MSU, you'll be able to find that. And we can put a link up in the chat. If you are more interested in giving of your time, please contact the college's Excel network. There are many ways alumni, retirees, and others with an MSU connection can help students with mentoring or political career connections. And that is Excel as an EXCEL network. Now it's time to get started with the exciting talks for today. And when I saw who was presenting, I thought, oh, I absolutely have to help out with this. I want to thank the speakers who are giving generously of their time on a Saturday. Jonathan Choti, Alexis Black, Amy DeRogatis, David Stowe, Candace Keller, and students Jason Durnay and Jennifer Junker-Meyer-Khan. They come from the African languages, art, theater, English, religious studies, and arts and cultural management. And this is such a great program. I'm so excited to see it with such a wide variety of expertise. And I know you're going to learn a lot, as will I, in the next few hours. So I'd like to go ahead and get started then. I'm going to introduce my own colleague, Jonathan Choti. He's going to be speaking on why diversity, inclusion, and equity matter. And I want to read just a little bit of introduction for him before he starts. Jonathan Choti's research interests focus on the morphophonology of Bantu languages. He also teaches Swahili and a course in the integrated studies in the arts and humanities that deals with African cultures, languages, and literature. Jonathan's research interests include second language, pedagogy, and language and culture. So please, Jonathan, if you would go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Let me share my slides really quick. Okay, thanks, Sonja, for that introduction. I'm going to speak about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and especially how this relates to my Swahili and African cultures classes. So welcome. So I have an outline. I'm going to speak to introduce the topic, share my teaching philosophy, which in a normal situation is around 3-4 pages. I reduced into one sentence. And then I'm going to define diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also give examples from our context, our society, how the short of diversity, equity, and inclusion show up every day in our experience. I will also talk about how I practice day in my classrooms, and I also share with you what I believe is student feedback on my implementation of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then I will conclude with remarks why these three norms are very important, not only in the classroom, but also in various contexts in our daily lives. Now, to me, I consider diversity, equity, and inclusion to be norms that enrich our lives daily. So when you're talking about norms, I believe these are like principles which guide our actions, our behavior in every situation. And that's the call I'm going to make to the audience. We need to think more, reflect more about these three norms. There's a tendency of people thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in terms of racial diversity or racial variations in our society. That's not the case. These are the norms which cut across different contexts in our life experience. In my teaching, they influences my teaching in so many ways. How to conceive and implement my teaching philosophy, my actions inside and outside of class, the way I approach different topics or issues in my classrooms, my interaction with the students and sometimes even peers and our hardworking workers in our units, my class, the kind of classroom atmosphere I create in my classrooms, whether virtual or physical, how I assess my students and provide feedback, how I choose and participate in professional development. This is just the main ones, but my application of diversity, equity, and inclusion go beyond this. So my teaching philosophy too includes or embraces diversity, equity, and inclusion. I strive to empower students through education in a pleasant classroom environment built on the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion, with the ultimate goal of preparing my students to contribute to society as globally engaged citizens who seek answers, questions, and create solutions to expand human undertaking and make a positive difference locally and globally. So some of the phrases I've used here are not really mine, but the message is the same. That's what drives my thinking or my teaching every day. And I take every class as a new context to exercise this. Because I'm teaching African cultures in the US, so my presence in the classroom and the content I bring and how we apply the knowledge I share with my students, it's just like telling them you need to move into to know more more than you know Michigan. You need to know how I grew up. You need to know how life works out in the other continents, for example, Africa. And this I show in my Swahili classes. Swahili is a Bantu language spoken in Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, and the DRC. That's quite a distance from Michigan. I also teach African cultures generally, languages, and literature. And for the last 5 years, I've been leading a 5-week summer education abroad program to Tanzania. And let me tell you, when I take we normally take around 8 undergrads and 2 graduate assistants. But every time we come to the end of the program, my MSc students, and this is a joint program with 3 universities in Tanzania, sponsored by the Tanzania Partnership Program and in the international programs and studies and programs. My students don't want to leave. Almost every year, I have to be ready to witness tears. My MSc students have to share tears and say, can we have one more week? Of course they can't. And most of them have always gone back through the Peace Corps programs so that they can go and extend their experience in Africa. And this really actually contradicts what the general view out there is about Africa. Or when I walk to my classrooms with my accent, and I'm from Kenya and things like that, telling my story. I grew up in a village where education wasn't a major priority. But the point is, my students at MSU need to know about other cultures and avoid depending on stereotypes, on what they read in social media and the TVs where people just want money. I have some general definitions of a day. Diversity, you cannot finish defining how we as a people or as humans, how the variations, the extent of variations, we vary in terms of race, color, ethnicity, nationality, religion, all this. But you can't finish. The students I meet in the classrooms, if you just look at race and color, ethnicity, or nationality, so what? Once you know that they're from different nationalities, so what choices are you going to make to be an effective teacher? So you have to go beyond this. You have to understand students, try to understand students' immediate context and immediate environment and immediate situations. I want to share an example shortly, how this kind of knowledge is very important in the way you deliver your curriculum, the way you give them feedback, the way you assess them, and things like this. So that is just a list of things which set us aside. But what's the need of knowing like we are diverse? Is if you know that we are diverse, then you will know like, how do I respond? How do I appreciate people whom we don't share some attributes with and things like that. So equity has to do with the fairness, how fair treatment, access to opportunity, advancement for all. I identify and eliminate barriers that impede full participation of others, including my students. Inclusion really asked me to authentically bring traditionally excluded individuals or groups into processes, of course, educational processes, activities, decision-making, policy-making in an instructional environment, how to share power and ensure equal access to opportunities and resources. So I'm going to be defining this more, but these are the guiding principles when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially as they relate to me as a professor. But before we do that, I just want to show you that diversity, equity, and inclusion are everywhere. Sometimes we don't see them because we are so conversant with them. They are just commonplace. We ignore them. But I want to show you why in my culture classes, this is where we begin. So what's the need? Look at your family. And I'm not here to just show my family. I have a very small family. Even if I grew up in a family of 16, my father with the two of his wives and him and his children, 7 children from my mother, and 7 children from my stepmother, 4 sons from my mother's family, and 4 sons with my stepmother, 3 daughters, my mom, 3 daughters, my stepmother. That was really a great pattern. That's why I grew up, and I'm the 4th born of a family of 7. And then growing up, I said, if I grow up and start a family, I don't think I'm going to do what my father did. I'm going for a lean family. And when I met my sweetheart, she's just there, you can see her. We talked about this before we said that we're gonna begin a family, how many kids we wanna get. So we were those 2 angels. This picture was taken in October last year in the Wharton Center, MSU campus, when I went to accept an award. So this was a school day, it was a work day. My wife, who works for MSU as well, so I asked her to get permission from my work so that they could join me during this event or at this event. And so my 2 daughters also, we got permission from their school district in Hazlet to join us in this event. I decided, and we decided as a family, that we are going out there to see how a member of our family is going to participate in an event and receive an award, and see the people who sponsored this award, what statements they want to make, and what have you. This is an intentional choice. This is an intentional decision we made as a family, or I made as Choti, and included my wife, we included our 2 daughters, and we said it's necessary for them to go and witness the event. That is an inclusion. If you did everything like this in every situation, you think about others, we will have less Black people being killed in this country. If everybody thought about this, we couldn't have had colonialism. We couldn't have had people going to Africa as missionaries to eradicate African cultures, and because of cultural imperialism, take our religions there, take everything there, devalue their currencies so their life expectancy can be at 54 years in 2007. You can support a people, you can support individuals without putting them down, without dismantling their cultures, their being. So I took my family there to give my kids an opportunity. In that context, all of us children, parents, wife, husband, father, mother, we were equal. We were accessed the same opportunity. We learned a lot from that experience and things like that. So everybody was included. Okay, we make cars in Michigan, but we don't just make one type of vehicle. In Detroit and in Lansing, we don't use one color. We know that people have different tastes and preferences. We have different tasks to accomplish. So we make our cars to cater for people's preferences, people's class, people's levels of income. We do all this knowing that we're gonna have to have variety. What about our vegetation out there? Look at that, beautiful. Some grass is in our golf courses, some is food, some is flowers, some we need timber, some is just the rainforest. Look at that mist in there. So this is the beauty we should always emulate in our human society. If we did this, we cannot be having some of the problems we have today, especially racial or at the workplace where people discriminate against others and what have you. So with those examples, my students are able to know why we should appreciate everybody. Look at, I come from the tropics in Africa, and Kenya is one of the popular destinations for tourists to want to see the wild game in their natural habitat. But you can still look even at our homes. What kind of pet do you have? Do you have a cat? What type of cat do you have? What type of dog do you have? Do you have dairy animals? Look at the zebras. Look at the Ugandan and whatever, the cows there with the long horns are from Uganda and things like that. The elephants, buffalo, that's variety, that is diversity. And each one of those animals needs space and needs to be appreciated. Okay, when it comes to language, I'm a linguist by training. English and Swahili, I teach Swahili, they are languages, just like Choti and somebody else is a human being. Languages are equal as far as I'm concerned. They communicate. People are able to communicate, share messages every day using their native language. But the structures are different. Look at English. In English, you say, my one beautiful child. So we have a possessive at the beginning, we have a numeral second, we have an adjective beautiful, then we have the head noun child. So how do I make my students understand that Swahili says that phrase, that noun phrase, mtoto wangu mmoja mrembo? So Swahili begins with the noun. Swahili begins with the noun and shows singular. The class CL is class 1. All nouns in class 1, singular begins with an M as a prefix. So it uses the prefix. In English, we use a suffix to show plural. And then, so we begin with the noun in Swahili, the possessive comes next, the numeral comes third, and the beautiful adjective comes last. That's a wild word order compared to English, but it's beautiful. If all languages behave like English, it would be boring. So we have to appreciate language alone can teach us how diversity shows up in our different contexts and how it makes things beautiful. Look at the plural. My two beautiful children. Swahili goes watoto wangu wawili warembo. So the sequence is the same in Swahili, like in the singular, but look at the morphemes or the prefixes for agreement. Wa, watoto, wangu, wawili, warembo. But it is consistent. Wa for plural, and and some wa there for singular. So the languages alone can show us that languages don't have to have the same word order. They don't have the same agreement patterns, but still they are languages. They share some features languages share, but they bring that beauty of variations, how some use the suffix domain, some use the prefix domain to communicate, and it's interesting. So when I have American students in my Swahili classes, some come for 1 year or 2 years, but they don't want to leave. They want to take the language up all the way to 4 years. I've had students came in for 1 year, they forgot and they stayed there for 4 years. Then they were asking me, why can't we have a minor in Swahili? So, okay, I don't know. Let's move on. So the diversity is good, it's beautiful, and that's how we should always perceive it. This assignment I gave out recently, asked students to, in my IH class to, I gave them the names of African countries, asked them to number the countries on the key, and then use the numbers on the map to show that they understand which country is where. If you look at these maps clearly, I'm running short of time. I want to try to rush through this. If you look at this map clearly, there's one student at the beginning who drew the map. She didn't have a computer. She drew the map by hand and tried to name the African countries. She didn't go very far. I think she scored like a 2 point or a 1.5, not because I think she's not smart, but because she doesn't have the right technology. In the interest of time, I want to go straight to, sorry for the time, what my students have said they think is well done in terms of diversity, inclusion, and equity. They say there's excellent student class engagement. They say the instructor understands other people's viewpoints, is committed, very genuine and honest, open to new opinions, very transparent with his life experience, wants every student to succeed, gave us enough time to go over the slides. So giving people enough time to accomplish tasks is a good thing. He cared about his students, make sure everyone understood what he taught. Life stories are important. He is very patient, tries very hard to help students. Helped me with another student. He's very fair, a word of equality, equal with every student. He is passionate, wraps up whatever he does of his students, gave everyone the chance to give their opinions. Group projects are important, constantly encouraging us to participate, to ask questions. It teach me Swahili after I graduate. I would love him to teach me. Very accommodating, pushes us to do our best. His method of teaching is great. All of my classes, he has been one of my best professors. Dedication to helping your students. Let's me go the last ones. He is kind and excited man who makes learning a language feel possible and fun. I think I will stop there and maybe allow a few minutes for questions and comment. I don't know whether there's a way we can share these materials, and I have to apologize. I mismanaged my time. And so in the interest of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I know you will excuse me. So Sonja, back to you for questions.
Well, Jonathan, thank you so much. And I know it's so easy to go over time when you're talking about such interesting things. So I appreciate that. I think I might have frozen there for a second. Sorry. First of all, I was watching. I don't see any questions in the chat or in the Q&A at this point. If someone has one, if you could put that in there quickly, so we can get to that. I did actually had one, if I could ask it of you. Okay. I find when I'm teaching language, because I teach German language as well as literature and culture and film, that language is an excellent way to access concepts of diversity, equity, inclusion, just because of the notion of linguistic difference. And just as you were saying, pointing out the difference in the word order and the plural. And I find that students can't even imagine that or thinking through a different language and the different concepts, and just even getting them to that point of realizing that the language that they speak shapes how much of they think. And I guess I was wondering, can you think of a good example where you've seen students realize this cognitive level of difference that I think is so important in accessing NADEI conversations?
Cognition with language. I don't have an example right away, but in our African languages, especially Swahili, we have cases where the culture conditions the syntax, how you use passive and active voice just because of the culture. Like in Swahili, I speak another African language, my mother tongue and Swahili. You cannot say, for example, my wife's name is Damaris. You can't say in my language, Damaris married Jonathan. That's wrong. You can't say that. So you say Damaris was married by Jonathan. If you have to use an active voice, you have to say Jonathan married Damaris. So that's the cultural influence on language. And there are so many other examples. But for the aspects of cognition, I'm sorry, I don't have an example right away.
Oh, no, thank you very much. And there's a question, and then I want to get to the question that was just typed in, and then we need to move on to the next speaker so we can keep time. But the question says, if inclusion is directed at traditionally excluded groups, how do we address traditionally included groups who may now feel excluded? And I think the question is getting at partially, that we're also valuing all of the groups who are, in these conversations. So we're not talking about only those who have been excluded are valued, but also we're talking about how rich our own experiences are who are in the traditionally included groups, and how appreciating the diversity of all of the people who are in the conversation. Jonathan, do you want to answer that question?
So yeah, I think that's why we need more conversations about the application of these norms. Let's take an example of my family. When I went with that event and I tried to get my students from their school classrooms, my kids, and my wife from our workplace to go and participate in an event which was involving a member of the family. So inclusion is a deliberate, it's like a quota system. It's just like everybody, these two categories of people know what inclusion is and know they know who is privileged and who is not. So when I take my daughters to MSU to participate in an event so that they can socialize them, they grow up knowing what their father does and why we have to work very hard to get the recognition. Their father and their mother knows that. So any context, don't get it in general terms. Just use the specific context and who is to be included. The inclusion of B doesn't mean exclusion of A. So you have to look at each context. You are giving opportunity for somebody who doesn't have. When you contribute to a food bank, to a food bank, I read on the food bank when I was in grad school a lot. It doesn't mean you lose what you have. You're only sharing and returning to the community. When we pay our bills to this corporate world and keep them going and accumulating money and being proud of their balance sheet, it doesn't mean they are going to lose anything. So when you include, it's stronger, and those who are, when you others join you on the included table, those ones who are there don't lose a thing. It depends on the context.
Thank you very much for the talk you gave, and I want to respect the next speaker, so we'll need to move on now to Alexis Black, and she is, hold on, I need to switch over here. She is speaking on innovations in modern choreography, intimacy for the stage. Alexis received her BFA in performance from Ohio University and her MFA in theater performance pedagogy with an emphasis in movement from Virginia Commonwealth University. Thank you. She is an educator, fight, movement, and intimacy, an intimacy director, performer, and director. As a professional actor and member of the AEA, she has worked with regional theaters, international tours, and in numerous shows in New York City. Her favorite credits include productions with the Dorset Theatre Festival, the Vampire Cowboys Theatre Company, and touring with TNT Britain. On the small screen, you can find her acting and performing stunts on AMC, the Discovery Channel, and the upcoming film Tower of Silence. As a fight and movement director, she has choreographed in Europe, South Korea, and regionally in the US, including as assistant fight director for Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet for the Tony Award-winning theater, the Shakespeare Theater in Washington, DC. In New York City, she choreographed for the New York Fringe over 20 productions off-Broadway and off-Broadway. She also served as assistant choreographer for Fool for Love on Broadway, starring Sam Rockwell and Nina Arianda. Additionally, Alexis is a certified intimacy director with Intimacy Directors International and a certified teacher in the Michael Chekhov acting technique. She is trained with Push Physical Theater and Anne Bogart's City Company and is a member of the Society of American Fight Directors, the Stage Directors and Choreographers Society, and the Association of Theater Movement Educators. Please welcome Alexis Black.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. And Jonathan, I love your talk. Thank you for that. I'm going to share my screen, hopefully successfully. Awesome. All right. Thank you all for being here. I'm so excited to be here for Classes with Cal. As Sonja said, I'm here for innovations in modern choreography, intimacy for the stage. So when thinking about choreography for theater, let me see if I can move this forward. Theatrical choreography techniques. Up until recently, perhaps only certain imagery came to mind. So thinking about choreography, you might think of big musical theater numbers like tap or jazz, lots of jazz hands. Or you might think of battles or sword fights or other combat techniques. But would you think of moments of physical intimacy between characters in a play? Up until about 2016, I didn't even know that there were tools to look at these scenes, tools that were specifically built to look at these scenes. And most of the time in a production, a lot of time was not spent on these types of choreographed scenes. They were not choreographed. But as a fight choreographer at the time, I was often asked to look at them, usually in relation to moments of simulated sexual violence. And while I would work my way through those choreographed moments with the skills I had from fight choreography, I knew that for those moments of intimacy, something was missing. And I needed more training and more help. And also as a movement coach, just working on any movement sequences, I would see so many shows, so many productions, from staged violence to comedic farcical movement sequences of tumbling. All of these were being choreographed. Even sequences of entrances and exits for the actors that were more intricate were being choreographed and had a structure. But this led me to really wonder, why are moments of staged intimacy not given the same attention as these fights or dance or other physical movements for the stage? And this led me to studying and seeking out and finding the emerging field of intimacy direction for the stage. And this is what I'm going to talk about today a little bit. I'm going to define staged intimacy, give a brief history and definition of this innovative new field within the theater and film industry. And specifically, I'm going to speak to the history and the definitions that I've been given within the companies that I've been certified for and worked with: Intimacy Directors International and Intimacy Directors and Coordinators. I will then discuss Intimacy Direction's foundation in the pillars, or we also call them the 5 C's because they all start with a C. These are 5 elements that are used to create compelling physical storytelling within intimate scenes for the theater, while having a focus on and maintaining both the physical and psychological safety of all of those involved in making those moments. So I've been talking about intimacy a lot. What are scenes of intimacy? So yes, these can be broadly defined as scenes that have intimate physical contact between characters. So this could be kissing, embraces, or simulated sex scenes. But this can also be expanded beyond these romantic moments. Intimacy can include familial intimacy, so mother to child, father to child, platonic, so embraces between friends, and even sexual tension or chemistry moments, so that energy between performers when there's actually no physical touch involved. And it's also an element in scenes of simulated sexual violence on stage. What is intimacy direction? So this is a comprehensive approach to the creation of scenes or moments of intimacy on the stage and screen, I'll say, but I do want to go a little bit into the 2 main types of intimacy professionals. So we have on one side the intimacy directors, and on the other side intimacy coordinators, and that's found in the title of the company I'm certified with, Intimacy Directors and Coordinators, because they do contain different skill sets. So intimacy directors are focused on live performance. So that's been mostly within the theater, academic and professional theater, but also now it's being moved to other areas of live performance, like opera is using intimacy directors now, just started. Dance there's just an article that came out about intimacy direction in dance a couple weeks ago. And so it's really expanding to any sort of live performance. And the intimacy coordinators, those are the intimacy professionals that work in film and TV. And there are different protocols for both. It's for people that know a little bit about fight direction. This kind of comes from that field, that fight directors work with live performance, and stunt coordinators, you might have heard that term before, they work in film and TV. So it's just kind of that difference in title. With all that being said, I started being mentored in 2016 by professionals in IDI at the time, Intimacy Directors International. And then I was certified through IDI and IDC within the past few years. And I want to get into the history of those two companies and how this happened. And I love alliteration, I guess. So who, what, when, the motivations and the movement that led to the methodologies of IDI and IDC. And I know we love acronyms in Cal, so I'm just going to keep using them. So here's a very brief historical overview and the journey to 2020. It starts with Tonya Sina, as far as we know. She coined the phrase or term intimacy direction in her graduate thesis for her MFA in 2006. And for that thesis and beyond, she began to research this work extensively. We do, as an organization, acknowledge that there are theater practitioners that have had practices around the areas of staging intimacy for longer than we know, but it wasn't really given a term or codified. And like I said, maybe fight directors would spend a few moments or use some of those techniques on moments of stage intimacy, but it wasn't really thought of as its own specialty until Tonya wrote about it in her thesis. And she not only wrote about it, but for that thesis, she did so much research. She pulled from biomechanics, movement analysis techniques, stage combat techniques. She even spoke to people in the professional sex industry to talk to them about their best practices for consent, so we could pull some of that consent work over. Multiple other movement methodologies, and she even looked into mental and emotional health resources, spoke to psychologists, etc. So she had a very comprehensive approach to the work that had just not been seen or done before. So that was for film, that was for live performance. Meanwhile, Alicia Rodas, who now runs all of the intimacy coordination for HBO and Netflix, she began setting best practices for intimacy coordination in TV and film. They met up. They also met with a woman named Siobhan Richardson, and the three of them connected over their work and formed Intimacy Directors International in 2016. But meanwhile, there were others that were working in Broadway and regional theater, very in depth on intimacy direction in their own ways. Sasha Smith, who's on the left, I should have put names here, was working with regional theaters in Chicago. And in 2016, Claire Warden, who's in the middle, worked with Denise Johnson, who is on the right there. And they worked with IDI at the time and then IDC to bring intimacy direction to New York City in a more stable way, and eventually to Broadway. And so Claire Warden and Denise assisting were the first intimacy directors on Broadway. But this became a national thing and an international thing. So additional professionals working with mentoring through IDI at the time and other intimacy companies that started forming. We're working on education for industry professionals. They were working in academic institutions, as I said before, opera, dance, unions such as Actors Equity and SAG-AFTRA. They worked with directors, and also it spread to the West End. Yarit Dor and Ida O'Brien were working with this extensively in England and Europe. And there are people in Australia, Canada. It's all over the place now. While all these people were working on this, due to, in part to Tonya introducing the term, it wasn't still well known even through 2016. Really, in 2017, it gained national attention due to the hashtag #MeToo movement. If you aren't aware of that somehow, activist Tarana Burke started using this term in 2006 to raise awareness of women who are being abused in the entertainment industry. And then actress Alyssa Milano made this idea viral with a tweet in 2017. So this really became a reckoning. And that was based really for TV and film, but it started to really have an impact in theater. Suddenly, through the lens of Me Too, actors began to see the problematic practices around staging intimacy, such as intimacy had been before just improvised movement with little or no direction. And this led to some problematic statements from directors, such as, okay, here's the romantic scene, just make out. Can you be sexier? What does that mean? Let the actors go in the other room and figure it out. There are horror stories of actors just being told to go to a separate room or a storage closet and to figure out their chemistry. Very problematic. And there's also times where there was direct pressure or bullying from directors or producers to just get through the scenes as fast as possible. Grab her, put your hand there, just do this kiss, get it over with. Slap him and kiss him. If you won't do it, there's hundreds of people behind you. So there's lots of problems here that create a culture, that had created a culture that was ignoring power dynamics, rewarding actors who did not voice their boundaries, encouraging actors to eliminate their agency and their body autonomy. Often, whether consciously or subconsciously, emphasized that the scene itself or the play was more important than the emotional or physical well-being of the actors performing those scenes. And I especially think about this now with COVID, when we get back into rehearsals, it really ignored sexual and physical health of these actors, just their hygiene in connecting without talking through things first. And most importantly, in some ways, or equally importantly, I should say, is that it was fostering unclear and poor storytelling, non-repeatable moments that were just improvised and unclear and messy, which doesn't create good theater. This culture, again, led to coercion, pressure, as I said before, objectification. I heard a director long ago mentioning that his actors were meat puppets, which is something that has just disturbed me for a long time. Times that where actors are being harassed, being forced into physical acts, which technically is assault, and again, poor, non-repeatable storytelling. So all of that really led to me seeking out the mentorship for years and training with IDI, which then dissolved and became IDC. And I really wanted to learn more about intimacy direction and combat this culture, all that cultural stuff, the problematic practices that I was talking about. A little bit more about intimacy direction, just to be specific. Oh, this is the definition of intimacy directors and coordinators. You can also look them up at idcprofessionals.com. So intimacy direction has three parts to it, mainly. It is an acting and movement specialty. So it's a movement specialist work. So those that are being an intimacy director, we need to be trained in choreography and physical storytelling at a high level. We help actors are given a written script or a verbal script, their dialogue. We are there to help write the muscular script of each moment. So you'll come to a moment in a script that says, in parentheses, they kiss, and that's it. We're there to, just like parentheses, they fight, and then a battle ensues on stage, right? That involves a lot of storytelling, a lot of specific moments that we need to look at just choreography-wise and movement specialist-wise. Next, there's a lot of protocols and procedures that the industry, intimacy direction, has helped put into place that are based in safety and consent and should be employed in every rehearsal hall. And then there's the advocacy part. A big part of our work is bringing attention to and giving the artists in the room agency over their bodies, despite or with acknowledging that there are power dynamics in the room, and advocating so that they have a voice in the process, that they have control over what stories they're telling with their bodies and how they're telling those stories. So it's very complicated how this all works in the rehearsal hall. It's a lot of training that's gotten myself and my colleagues to this point. But in general, something I wanted to tell you all about are the 5 pillars, because those are a big foundation of how we work as intimacy directors or coordinators. These came from Intimacy Directors International first, and then they have now been adopted by IDC. But these are the IDI pillars of staging intimacy. And as I said, they're the 5 C's. Always makes me think of a pirate a little bit, but we have context, communication, consent, choreography, and closure. I'm going to briefly go over each of those. So context, this is basically the who, what, when. So what are these moments that have sexual content or sexual intimacy in the play, or platonic or familial. And let's look at that text, and that could be some things that are called for in the text itself, or things that are arising from the director's interpretation. And why and how do we need this intimacy in this moment? That's really helpful for the actors to understand that in order to do the best storytelling and know what's happening to their bodies. Consent, huge and important. All of these intersect, but this is like one of the biggest pillars, of course. So it just talks about discussing our physical boundaries. So we need to be specific about the quality of touch, the areas of bodies that may or may not be touched. And that is led by the context. What is the story? How are we going to tell it through this touch or not touch based on the boundaries of the actors? And something that intimacy direction really did is started to bring consent to before the process begins. So the actors need to be informed about what the story is and what they might be asked to do in order to fully consent to being a part of that process. Communication. So during rehearsal, actors need to keep checking in with their partners, making sure everyone is feeling safe and confident. Comparing it again to fight direction, when we're rehearsing a fight that's physically challenging, we might need to do something in slow motion, or mark something, or do like a substitution for that movement until we can communicate more fully and work our way through it in a safe and confident way. So just bringing up time to talk. Choreography. So we really establish the moments and like who initiates it, what's the progression of the moment, its duration and intensity, how it reaches its conclusion. And I know that might seem kind of obvious, but it just wasn't ever talked about before. And again, that made it not safe, consensual, or repeatable. So we needed the same story that they're telling in Aladdin, the national tour in New York City when they start, should be the same story that Seattle gets, right? And through really identifying what the physical progression of that story is, that makes that way more repeatable, safe, and consensual. And stage management's SM is stage managers write down all of the blocking, all the movements of the actors, and then they actually run the show when they're on tour or in theatrical production. And they are asked to write down this choreography so the actors can refer back to it. Finally, closure. At the end of every rehearsal or a filming of a rehearsal or filming of a scene of intimacy, the actors are encouraged to have a closing moment. This could be personal or with their partner. And it's about practicing self-care. It's about having a bookend that is separating your imaginary world, that world of the character, from your real life. And this has been really helpful because if you think about actors doing a fight for many years together, not years, for many productions together, many run of a show, you don't really worry about them starting to hate each other during that show. And might not need closure as much. But when you have these intimate physical moments, it's really good to separate and go, okay, I was a character, now I am my human self. I'm in a workplace. And to have that moment where you connect in and separate can really help the actors just find and practice self-care. So overall, I know that was a lot and there's so much more to talk about. I could talk about it forever, but the goal of this work, at least with intimacy directors and coordinators, is to raise the bar and eliminate harm. You can find more at that website there. But through the use of the pillars, movement training, defined protocols, and advocacy for the actors, we really are working to create environments and a new culture that is physically and psychologically safe and allows for the building of dynamic, repeatable moments built from a place of enthusiastic consent. And I'm just thrilled to be at the cutting edge of these innovative techniques and bringing them to Michigan State and to how it supports the culture of care in the College of Arts and Letters. And it really just makes me want to use the hashtag Wintimacy. So that is very quick brief overview of intimacy direction.
Well, thank you so much, Alexis. That was just fascinating. As a theater goer, it's really interesting to see what goes on behind the scenes and pre-production. There are a couple of questions, and we do need to make sure that we're keeping cognizant of time. One is, how do you handle situations in which actors actually develop romantic feelings for each other in the course of the show?
Okay, well, we are not the sex police, if I may use that phrase. So it can help happen. We give them tools to separate work from the imaginary play, but also theater is such a collaborative experience that sometimes what we call showmances might happen. And as long as that is consensual, as long as that's not impacting their work on stage, and we might need to talk about that, that's really not any of our business. But we do ask that like things like flirtation and stuff needs to happen outside of the room, that once you're in the room, it's a professional workplace. And the way that we engage with each other is based on those pillars. And that even if you're friends outside of the room, if your romantic partners outside of the room, married couples will still use these pillars and talk about boundaries within the confines of the scene, the container of the scene, as we call it. So it's really just about communication and keeping the room a workplace. And then, you know, if I love love, if they want to fall in love, that's great. But it is about being healthy and safe and being able to mentally separate the work from your real life.
Great, thank you. And then the other question is, have you done any work with simulated patients?
Oh, you know, I have not, but that's something that we're talking about wanting to do. Just the consent practices and talking through the pillars. I know that people talk to business schools about this work right now, and you know, in dance and opera and things, it's very important to talk about enthusiastic consent. And there's other things in intimacy direction that would be useful for doctors that are working with patients to know, like body language and you know, their openness and reading body language to understand when and how to approach people. So that's something I'd be very interested in, but haven't yet done.
We have one more question, and let's just do it quickly. How do you prepare actors for that endpoint separation? May you provide examples of materials you provide them?
For closure? I think that might be what they mean, their endpoint separation. So we encourage them to create a ritual. And, you know, the example we give is a tapping out. It's very simple. We would change this for COVID if they couldn't touch, of course, but that would involve 3 points of contact: eye contact, breath, so some sort of internal expansion. So you breathe together and then you like give a high 10 and then you go, okay, now we're done. That would be one example, but there's so many ways to find closure. And I do give actors multiple ways in. That could be personal and professional. So you could have a different way. You know, I have actors that want to do a fist bump and that really gets them out of the moment. Or saying a certain phrase together, or being like, hey, you good? Okay, we're great. Just checking in. And then if you need to go for a walk, if you need to listen to music, like there are other ways to continue with closure and self-care that isn't involved with your partner necessarily.
All right, great. Thank you. We'll need to stop there because we need to move on to our next speaker. But thank you so much, Alexis, for
such so much.
Talk. Our next speaker is Amy DeRogatis. She will be speaking on Seeing is Believing, the Curious Case of the Contested Image of Elvira Eliza Field. She is a professor of religion and American culture in the Department of Religious Studies, and is the recipient of the William J. Beale Outstanding Faculty Award, which recognizes excellence across the mission of the university. Her research focuses on the multiple ways that religious groups, people, and communities in the US translate religious beliefs into embodied practices. Her most recent book, Saving Sex, Sexuality, and Salvation in American Evangelicalism, delved into the history of popular evangelical sex manuals and the efforts that authors made to convince readers that embodied sexual practices and restraints constitute a form of witnessing their faith. She has also published Moral Geography, Maps, Missionaries, and the American Frontier. She is at work on her third book, Mormon King, about James Jesse Strang and the Strangite community on Beaver Island, Michigan. She is also the co-director of the American Religious Sounds Project, a collaborative digital initiative supported by the Henry Luce Foundation to document and interpret the diversity of American religious life by attending to its varied sonic cultures. This work has recently been featured for its work on religious sounds during the COVID-19 pandemic. So please welcome Amy DeRogatis.
Thank you so much, Sonja, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to read a bit of a paper that I'm working on for publication called Seeing is Believing. And oops, let me share my screen. Can't believe I almost forgot that. Okay. So, oops, sorry about this. Here we go. So an image has been on my mind for about 5 years. The image that sits on my desk is a printed copy of a digital photo of a daguerreotype of Elvira Eliza Field, the first plural wife of Prophet James Jesse Strang. Field is dressed as Charles J. Douglas, or Charlie, as Field was called, for 6 months during fall 1849 to spring 1850. Elvira Field, a young Mormon woman from Michigan, secretly married Prophet Strang on July 13th, 1849, and traveled with him later that year on an East Coast missionary tour. Dressed as his fictitious nephew, Charlie Douglas, Field served as Strang's personal secretary and close confidant during the mission. So the original is housed in special collections in the Clark Historical Library at Central Michigan University in Mount Pleasant. Digital copies of the images can be found on the internet, and reproductions may be found in public archives, books, and public holdings. I first came across this image early in my research on James Jesse Strang, the King of Beaver Island, Michigan. Anyone who spent time with this 19th century Strangite Mormon movement has seen a copy of the picture of Elvira Field. Over the past years, I've used it in public talks and in teaching. For me, the image serves as an entryway into the fascinating religious movement that culminated in the crowning of a Mormon king, the proclaimed true successor, he would say, of the prophet Joseph Smith, that happened on a remote island in the middle of Lake Michigan. Strang's story is rich with golden plates, angel visitations, secret rituals, new scripture, political intrigue, and lots of scrappy fights with other contenders for the mantle of the prophet position in Mormonism, particularly Brigham Young. So Strang's communal religious experiment that ended up on Beaver Island, though it was short-lived, is the subject of a few different scholarly works. Mostly they're biographical. Some of them are kind of interested in the politics of the program, but they were mostly done by either LDS scholars or journalists and a couple of regional scholars. The part of the story that first captured my attention and continues to hold my attention is that of young Elvira Field living for a man for half of a year. Specifically, my interest centers on this remarkable image. Field's direct stare and almost indecipherable smirk, to my mind, encapsulates the hubris of Strang's public anti-polygamy platform, which was one of the cornerstones of his claim to the prophet's position, and his enormous ambition to achieve extraordinary aspirations. I have many questions about the image. Why call attention to yourself when you're being disguised and sit for a photograph? Who kept the photograph? How was it displayed? And in the early Mormon religious world of visions, angels, and spectral revelation, how did this visual image operate? Was it used as physical empirical evidence, which was not, by most historical accounts, a completely believable ruse? Or was it just simply a private joke shared between lovers that has stayed with us throughout the time? So for all of my interest in the photograph, I had actually never considered the possibility that this was not Elvira Field. Thus, it was a big surprise to me when I saw a comment on a Mormon podcast that really challenged the daguerreotype's provenance. So I've scoured archives from Provo, Utah to Lansing, Michigan to New Haven, Connecticut. I've read everything I can about Field and the Strangite movement. And I've even interviewed Field's great-granddaughter who lived in the family home in Eaton County, Michigan. And I have to say, I delivered a copy of the image to her. And I did this all with the certainty that the identity was correct and that this was the figure in the image. So what would it mean if the photograph was misidentified? Does it change the story? Regardless of provenance, what role has this image played in directing my research and scholarship about the movement? And will I tell the same story if this is not, in fact, Elvira Eliza Field? So some background here. Who's James Strang, and how did Elvira Eliza Field get tangled up with him? So James Jesse Strang grew up in Western New York in the early 19th century. In his youth, he kept a secret diary that was written in code, where he expressed the desire to attain fame and to marry into royalty. Although he was a Baptist, he described himself in his diary as a cool philosopher and free thinker. He would eventually go on to practice law, become a county postmaster, edit a newspaper, distinguish himself as a champion debater and lecturer on temperance. And he gets married, has 4 children in 12 years. But it's when he goes to Nauvoo, Illinois, which was the center of the Mormon community in 1844, that he gets converted to Mormonism. He's baptized by the prophet Joseph Smith, ordained by Smith's brother, and then commissioned to go to Wisconsin, to a town called Voorhees near Burlington, to set up a stake for the Mormon community. And then a few months later, Joseph Smith is assassinated. Right after that happens, in fairly short order, newly converted Strang sets out to claim the mantle of the prophet. So to accomplish this, Strang reported that at the moment of Joseph Smith's death, he received a revelation from an angel who ordained him. He also received a letter of appointment from Joseph Smith a few days before Joseph Smith died. This is something he claims. While many people disputed the authenticity of that letter, other people were convinced and started to follow James Jesse Strang as the new prophet of Mormonism. From the start, one of the important issues for Strang and for his followers was he disavowed polygamy or plural marriage, and he set himself apart from many other contenders, most notably from Brigham Young. So within 4 years from when Joseph Smith dies, James Jesse Strang will move his community from Wisconsin to Beaver Island, Michigan. And it's during that time that he first sets his eyes on the 18-year-old Ms. Field. So Elvira Field was a seamstress and school teacher from Eden Rapids, Michigan. Her family met up with Strangite missionaries, and then eventually they moved to Beaver Island. Sometime in the summer of 1848, one of the associates of James Jesse Strang came to her in private and said, the prophet would like to marry you. And when he establishes his divine kingdom on Beaver Island, he has tapped you to be his first plural wife and the queen of the kingdom. The marriage, she agreed to it. The marriage was kept secret, even from her parents, and happened somewhere in Michigan on July 13th, 1849. So even though this marriage was a secret, Strang wanted his new wife to come with him on an East Coast missionary tour. So to do that, she had to disguise herself as this fictitious 16-year-old nephew, Charles Douglas. She cut her hair, she dressed in men's clothing, adopted what she saw as masculine mannerisms, and understood that doing this was important because she was going to play a role in the eventual millennial kingdom. So at some point, probably in the fall, she visited a daguerreotypist and had a commission, had a picture taken of herself. And the picture in question that you're looking at is about 2 inches by 3 inches in size. It's hinged, it's in a little square box with leather tooling. And it opens up and you can see that there's a gold frame around the image. It's about 1 inch thick when it's closed. And the image is also, when you go to the archives, they're feeling like I need to move my face here. When you go to the archives, there is a slip of paper that talks about the provenance, right? So here it says that Elvira Field, wife of James Strang, when she was married, picture probably taken in New York, 1850. And it also says what collection it was brought in. There are 3 other daguerreotypes from the family that look similar to this, that were from the same collection and deposited at the same time, and they all have the exact same note that is with it. So the question of provenance here has to do with whether or not people in her family indeed had this daguerreotype, and it just was a picture of somebody else, but they thought it was a picture of her dressed as Charlie Douglas, or if the person who deposited it, this Ellison, if he sort of snuck it in as something to make the collection more desirable. So, you know, thinking about this, though, putting aside maybe for a second the idea of provenance, the question for me also is, this is a material artifact, an important image. How should I interpret it in my story? Because I know that it comes out, if it's authentic, it comes out of a very particular religious and historical moment. But I also know that the way that I interpret it is necessarily going to be different from the people who created it and what their needs were. And so I want to start by thinking about what might be the needs of somebody who in this situation would create this picture. And what I suspect the photograph, being photographed as a man, made real for both Elvira and for Strang, something that was a pretty flimsy disguise. And what I want to argue is that the object, the daguerreotype, became physical and visual evidence that legitimated both Field's transformation into Douglas and some of Strang's theological claims. So we shouldn't be surprised that Strang and Field might have desired to provide visual proof of the authenticity of both, because optical evidences like this were at the heart of Mormonism as well as the early Strangite movement. So I want to talk a little bit about seeing as believing. The Book of Mormon that was put together, that was the revelations of Joseph Smith, taught readers how to see and decipher visual spiritual phenomenon. When Joseph Smith saw angels and used seer stones like this one to interpret golden plates, he included eyewitness testimonies in his new printed Bible, the Book of Mormon, is saying that they saw the golden plates. He was trying to train his followers to decipher spectral evidence through the use of new technologies. So in the context of 19th century cultural interests and finding like ghosts and spirits and new technologies like photography and telegraphy, Smith was able to translate his vision through the medium of a text that was fixed and shareable. So how could such fantastic spectral claims be believed? Well, in this context, new technologies like the microscope and photography, as well as increasing interest in evidence and observation, were being part of a larger cultural shift to discern truth from deception. So when Joseph Smith used something like these seer stones to translate his golden plates that were revelation for him, he was using kind of like a folk technology that was similar to optical machines of his day. Similarly, the angelic visitations and physicality of golden plates that were printed in the book with eyewitness testimony. So in the Book of Mormon, there are these people who testify that they saw things with their own eyes and they held golden plates. These made these subjective spiritual experiences kind of real and tangible. So like Joseph Smith, James Strang saw angels. He received revelation and found and translated golden plates. unlike Joseph Smith, he shared a lot of the things. So for example, this letter of appointment that he received from Joseph Smith, he showed people and he had them look at it and he had them see for themselves if this was real or not. He did the same thing with golden plates that he dug up that were sacred texts that he then put in a book called the Book of the Law of the Lord. He passed these golden plates around and had people look and decide for them. So there's a lot of emphasis on sort of eyewitness and seeing for yourself and observing for yourself. And so this brings me back to the image that I want to talk about. The question of why Elvira Field might have gone to a photographer is one we should consider in light of these optical technologies. They could have been enlisted by Strang and Smith to provide evidence for supernatural phenomena. In the context of Strang, presenting material evidence was incredibly important. He really needed to make the case that this was in fact a young man who was his nephew who was with him, because he needed to be able to argue that he was still anti-polygamy as he was building his community up. And he was on the East Coast to bring people back to Beaver Island. So whether or not this is actually authentic, what we know is that the people coming to hear Strang preach on the East Coast didn't really believe that, many of the people didn't believe that Charlie Douglas was in fact a man. And there were a number of people who argued publicly that they thought that Charlie Douglas may in fact have been a woman. Strang always denied all of those accusations. So one of the things that's really remarkable is that it's not just that Field dressed as a man, but she also acted as a man for this religious group for 6 months. So as she was disguised as Strang's nephew, she was also his personal secretary, and she participated in male rituals, discussions, and activities. She was writing for the newspaper, the Gospel Herald, and she probably participated in male priesthood obligations, including administering the sacrament, healing the sick, and baptizing converts. But the most notable thing about her is that in the Gospel Herald, she wrote about the accusations that were made against her publicly. And so there's, in the month of November, there's all of these people writing in saying, we don't believe that Charlie Douglas is in fact a man. And she is writing about it and signing her name and often editorializing about it. So dressed as Charlie Douglas, Field becomes the object of speculation, and also is it's questioning the legitimacy of Strang's prophetic claims. So when leaders of the Strangite movement started to accuse Douglas of being disguised as a woman, they weren't really mad at her. They were really angry with Strang. And then they publicly called for an investigation to uncover the truth of her sex. They were hoping to expose Strang as a hypocrite and a fraud. So revealing that Douglas was a woman would prove false Strang's rejection of plural marriage, which was a cornerstone of his legitimacy. So while it's really remarkable that one person cross-dressed for 6 months could potentially dismantle the theological and social structure that supported this burgeoning community, it's also interesting because followers who believed in the truth of angelic visitations, divine callings, golden plates with scripture, and other miraculous occurrences were ready to abandon the prophet if Charlie Douglas were found to be a woman. So it's at this kind of transitional moment as his community is building, as he's trying to get converts, that all of this is going down. And she really becomes the physical embodiment of this transitional moment. So when she finally stops dressing as a man is when she and Strang and some new converts go back to Beaver Island in 1850. And when she returns there, she's dressed as a woman. And within a few months of their return to Beaver Island, there is a huge coronation ceremony because James Strang will be crowned as the king of Beaver Island, the king of the Strangite community, because he will be seen by his followers as God's representative on earth. There's all kinds of pomp and circumstance around this event. There's also a document that gets signed by all the members of the kingdom that they say they've crowned a true king and he's the fulfillment of prophecy. And then afterwards, King Strang sets up a community with a set of laws and guidelines that need to be followed. One of the first things that he does is he institutes plural marriage, and then we'll go on to marry a few more women. But another thing that he does on Beaver Island is he sets up a set of like rules and prohibitions that get set out for the community, and not just believers, but they're also Gentiles, non-believers who are living on the island. And one of the things he does is he says that all of the saints, the people following him who are female, have to wear a new bloomer costume. So these are these like pantalettes and long. Yep.
Amy, we need to wrap up. Could you finish up?
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
I'm so sorry. So anyway, what I want to say is that there's this controversy about this daguerreotype, and that it seems to me that there's also very interesting about how we interpret religious groups, and that oftentimes when we interpret religious groups, we look at like the beliefs and sort of the doctrine around them. But in this religious group, as it's getting going, one of the really important things might have been a piece of material culture that was getting circulated around to uphold things that may or may not have been true. For myself, in my research, I want to acknowledge that I've been totally directed towards this, to learning about this group, because of a material object that I think tells us an awful lot about who these people were and ways in which they validate themselves as a community and some of their basic beliefs. So I'm sorry I went over, but that is where I am in my research right now.
Well, great. Thank you so much. That's so interesting, connecting some of Michigan history with the broader national context. Are there any questions for Amy? And I really appreciate how you talk around, as you were saying, focusing on this material culture and telling stories from, and placing that in context with the technological developments and the developments of the religious, the developments within Mormonism at that time. It's all very fascinating as a utopian community as well, as it's often perceived to be.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, here's one question. Is there anything left to see on Beaver Island?
Yeah, so if you go there today, you can see, so St. James Harbor is named after James Strang, of course, but there are features in the landscape. King's Highway is the main street. There is also an old Mormon post office, but that's not as historically legitimate as they say it was, and a jail. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Amy. I really appreciate it. That was just fascinating. And with all of the PowerPoint was great too. So thank you very much. We have time now for a short break. We had 10 minutes planned, Penny. Should we take the 10 minutes or do you want to do 5? What do you think?
I think if we could take a quick break and reconvene at 11:35, that'll get us back on schedule and we'll be good.
Okay, sounds good. Then take a 5-minute break and we'll be back at 11:35. Thank you so much.
Hello.
Sonja, your microphone is not on.
I'm talking, and I'm muted, which I've been doing so much recently. What's that about? So welcome back, everybody. I see that David has joined us as well. I hope you had a good mini break. We will continue on with the program. And our next speaker is David Stowe. He will be speaking on Babylon Revisited. This is a good transition from the talk we just had from Amy. Babylon Revisited, History, Memory, and Forgetting in Psalm 137. David is a faculty member in English Department and Religious Studies. His research and teaching interests focus on the 20th century cultural history of the US, particularly the study of vernacular music. His most recent book is No Sympathy for the Devil, Christian pop music, and the transformation of American evangelicalism with University of North Carolina Press. His previous book, How Sweet the Sound, Music in the Spiritual Lives of Americans, won the Deems Taylor Award from the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers. Stowe's first book, Swing Changes, Big Band Jazz in New Deal America, was also published in Japanese translation. He has written articles on the New York cabaret culture and politics in the 30s and 40s, Japanese jazz artist Toshiko Akiyoshi, and the musical history now of Psalm 137, which you will hear about in a moment, in the US and the Caribbean, whiteness studies, copyright and fair use for academic authors, and church conflict during the Great Awakening. He is also a founding member of the Institute for the Study of Christianity and Culture, which is a Michigan-based research institute that sponsors lectures and symposia by leading scholars from around the country. So David, please go ahead.
Well, thank you, Sonja. And it's great to be part of this program because I am a firm believer in finding ways to keep retired faculty and staff involved in the college. It's always seemed to me a real shame that all this experience and knowledge and wisdom is lost when you hit a certain age or when you take your retirement. So hopefully we're moving into a future where there will be life after retirement and people can find new ways of being involved. It's also great to hear from some colleagues in the college that we don't really hear much about each other's work, especially colleagues outside of our own department. We hear a lot about people when they come for job interviews and job talks, but then unless we're involved in annual review, we don't really hear much more about them. So this is really great, and I'm honored to be part of this panel. So I'm going to call up my presentation. And I think the bio that Sonja used was slightly out of date because this is actually another book that has come out on the Psalm, has already been published. And so in a sense, this is research that I've been working on for a while. It's not unpublished research, but I keep revisiting it. For one thing, I continue to give talks on the Psalm because, of course, there's always a huge audience to learn about Hebrew Psalms. But the other reason is that it's uncanny the way this Psalm seems to speak to contemporary issues and conditions in the world. So I'm actually collaborating with a colleague in English and film studies, a very talented documentary filmmaker. We're trying to create a documentary film based on this Psalm, sort of following the sorts of arguments and materials that I write about in this book, because obviously for a Psalm and for a history that involves so much visual art and music, film would really make the subject come alive in a way that a book just can't. So see if I can advance this. I think I need to go here. All right. So for those of you who do not have total command over 150 of the biblical Psalms, here is the text of Psalm 137. I'll give you a minute to read it quickly. It's not a terribly long psalm, only 9 verses, but it is quite dense in the amount of information it contains. And I'll be coming back to the psalm in segments as I give my talk. But I just want to point out probably the most famous lines from this psalm are verse 1, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, we wept when we remembered Zion. That particular line or phrases from it have been used very widely as titles of books and articles and many other media. And maybe the other really memorable, widely used line is verse 4, how shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? And again, if you do a search of publications, you will find, dozens of books that use this phrase in some form. So it's a very resonant psalm. It's not considered one of the most artful songs, but it does have some aesthetic qualities. So just as a work of poetry, I'd like to point out a couple of things that it's got this kind of symmetry, this kind of parallel structure. So it begins with an image of rivers, water in Babylon, ends with an image of stones. It's got a couple passages of indirect reported speech. So in verse 3, the captives are quoted as saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. And in verse 7, the children of Edom are quoted as well. So interesting parallels there. And then the center of the psalm, and it's considered to have a kind of envelope construction. You can see verses 5 and 6 at the center of it, this kind of meditation on memory and forgetfulness. If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, and then the sort of inverse, if I do not remember thee, and this sort of calling forth of these punishments, right? Let my right hand forget her cunning, or let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. So the poet, in a sense, holding himself to this vow of memory at the risk of these physical punishments. So I mentioned that the psalm speaks to contemporary issues. When I was finishing this book a few years ago, it was the peak period of the kind of meltdown that took place in Iraq and Syria, the rise of ISIS, the huge outmigration, millions of refugees pouring out of Syria, destabilizing European politics, the whole issue of how do we deal with this immigration, this refugee crisis? And it really had implications across Europe and really across the world. And it's interesting, it was the same region, right? It was all taking place in the Euphrates Valley around these rivers of Babylon. So a contemporary story dealing with death and atrocity and forced migration. And of course, yes, some of the figures, this is really a peak of forced migration, displaced people worldwide, even surpassing the levels of displacement that we saw after World War II, which had been record setting, and we've actually eclipsed that in terms of internally displaced people, refugees, asylum seekers, so forth. So really a global crisis. And then, of course, in our own politics, after the book came out, we saw issues of immigration from Latin America, right? The Build the Wall becoming a central issue, and various kinds of atrocities taking place at our southern border, and a kind of closing of borders more generally. The other way in which the psalm is very resonant is in the notion of our own country being a strange land. These are a couple of earlier titles, An American in a Strange Land, Strangers in Their Own Land, a couple of studies And there were lots of articles being written about this, and I think still written about it. This sense of people who had been out of the country, that they didn't recognize the country, that it had changed in some fundamental ways and felt very strange to them now. And I think the time when this is brought home to the majority of Americans is the moment we're living in right now, right? Every 4 years we have a presidential election. And because of the way the country is divided, roughly half the country feels like this is a strange land. You know, what is going on here? Who are these people that are voting for the other candidate? What are they thinking? And so it sort of shifts back and forth depending on who wins the election. You know, the red states will feel the blue states are a strange land, and vice versa. So we're the past extraordinary week, we've been living through the most recent iteration of this. And I was interested in the Hebrew, that original phrase, Aladmat Nechor. I don't speak Hebrew, but I was able to identify this phrase. How do we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? Sometimes translated as a foreign land, sometimes as a strange land. And the literal Hebrew meaning is on the ground of the stranger. Right, so this kind of helps make sense. You can feel like a stranger as a refugee or an immigrant in a new country, but you can feel like a stranger if you're living in a country that doesn't seem like it's the country that it used to be, or that it claims to be. So I think of this quotation from Abraham Lincoln: "A house divided against itself cannot stand." I believe the government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. And I thought about that line a lot in the last week. Can this government endure permanently half red and half blue? I think we're at a real sort of crisis point, and it will be interesting to see how that plays out, regardless of who occupies the White House in January. So, just quickly through the book, I sort of treated the psalm in 3 sections. The opening 4 lines, the ones that have been used the most in music. I study music and culture, and so my starting point for this project was looking at various versions and settings of the psalm in popular music and popular culture and classical music. So these are the lines that get put to music and sung. It's also a very vivid visual scene. I mean, if you think about it, it's painting a vivid picture. It's narrated in the third person plural. You know, we wept, we remembered, we hanged our harps. So it's a scene that you can really picture. And so for that reason, it's lent itself to art as well. And this scene has been painted many times over the millennia. And so some images, this is an ancient one from roughly the time of the Babylonian captivity that took place, by the way, in 600 BCE, actual historical event. Here's some captives carrying harps being marched somewhere, and you see trees in the background. Interestingly, though, this bas-relief, this Assyrian bas-relief, was actually carved shortly before the Babylonian exile. And contemporary, more recent painting, there are many of these painted in Europe and also illuminated manuscripts, but you can see this image of all the instruments, not just harps being hung up, but horns and violins and everything else. And then in popular music, a lot of people will recognize this version that was created by the Jamaican group, the Melodians, "By the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down." And so basically, you can see those 4 first verses of the psalm. This is a song that became very popular. It's been covered by dozens of artists and ended up in various movies. But there are other versions as well. Folk version, Don McLean had a version of his on American Pie. There's a different setting in the musical Godspell. So this is one way in which the psalm has sort of permeated or made its way into popular culture. Most people knowing the song wouldn't necessarily have any idea that it comes from a biblical psalm, but it's interesting from that point of view. The middle of the psalm is this self oath, you might call the poet sort of holding himself to cultural memory, okay, sort of reminding himself to remember Jerusalem, remember his God in captivity and exile, and not to be distracted by temptations of foreign gods, foreign culture. So these two verses, not used in popular culture as much, but very important in social and political movements, as a way of sort of stealing the movement, of creating a sense of being compelled. Okay, we're not going to forget our cause. We're not going to forget our people. We're going to make sacrifices to remember and work for the preservation of whatever it is, culture, values, group identity, community strength, and so forth. And it's worth pointing out the word remember, very important in the Hebrew Bible, used something like 169 times. So this notion of memory, compelling memory. Sometimes humans are asking Yahweh to remember. Sometimes Yahweh is asking humans to remember. So this is an important theme. Now, to look at a particular political usage, the great American abolitionist Frederick Douglass made the psalm central to possibly his most famous speech, What to a Slave is the 4th of July, in which he places enslaved Africans in the position of the Hebrews, right? The Judeans mourning alongside the river. And so very powerful analogy. And that line of thought has been continued in the church, particularly the Black church. Many great preachers have used that text. I want to mention in particular C.L. Franklin from Detroit, great Baptist preacher who was also father of Aretha, one of the most successful and well-known preachers of the middle of the 20th century. And I should also say that that's a political use of the psalm in the United States for sort of liberation, anti-racist movements. But it's also an important psalm and sentiment in Zionism, and it's been taken up by many groups that have felt themselves displaced, in danger of losing their identity. So Irish immigrants to the United States resonated to this psalm, Korean immigrants, Cubans. So it's had this kind of universal appeal to many different groups. The final verses are maybe the infamous ones, especially the final verse. This is the one that a lot of people remember about the psalm, this image of being happy to take and dash the little ones against the stones, right? So this very violent, vengeful spirit of the psalm. And this has created trouble for lots of religious folk and for musicians. I mean, these lines are rarely performed. They're rarely read in worship either. Christians have had a hard time with this part of the psalm, rarely used in Judaism. Orthodox Jews use the full psalm for certain occasions, but it's difficult. And so in this section of the book, I sort of reflect on violence and vengeance. And I was taken by a quotation from C.S. Lewis that it's especially hard for us to accept this psalm given the conditions we live in. But of course, 2,500 years ago, these sort of punishments and actions were commonplace. And actually, I argue they're very commonplace in today's world. And we're sort of fooling ourselves if we don't see that kind of violence against innocents. I I reflect on violence as perpetrated against Jews in the Holocaust, where Jews were often placed in that same situation, urged by their captors to sing songs and perform music in the death camps. I just heard my alarm go off, which is a reminder that I need to wrap up to give time for discussion. There's obviously a lot more to say about each of these themes and each of these sections of the psalm, but I will stop here. I've created a website that has some great audio visual materials for anyone who wants to see more about how this psalm has been depicted and represented.
Great, thank you, David, for such an interesting talk. It's fascinating to see how that one psalm has been reflected in so many different spaces and the popular cultural references as well. Does anyone have any questions for him? And I apologize, thank you for pointing out the correction that this has already come out as a book. That's very important to acknowledge. While we're waiting, could you talk a little bit about how you're carrying on then are you continuing on work on this particular psalm, or are you working on a new project that's related to it?
Well, like I said, I'm working on this documentary film with Swarnaval Pillai from Film Studies, and it takes a while. I would say it's been on the back burner, maybe for both of us, but the first step is to really get some grant funding for it. And so we have been investigating NEH grant programs. We had one promising grant that they changed they do support filmmaking, but they sort of changed the criteria. Obviously, it's a very unstable period in terms of federal funding, but we still believe that it will make a great film, that it lends itself to a documentary film. So that's on the back burner. I've been doing actually some creative writing to take a little break from research in music and religion, which I've been occupied with for about 20 years. But my next project deals with actually an American composer, William Billings, considered the first really important homegrown American composer who was active in Boston in the period of the Revolutionary War, was in the circle of Paul Revere and Samuel Adams and so forth. And actually, one reason I found out about him was he did a setting of Psalm 137 called By the Rivers of Watertown. Again, drawing an analogy between the American colonists suffering under British tyranny and languishing beside the Charles River.
Oh, that sounds fascinating. There is a question now, and I'll read it out loud. So what are the special occasions when the full psalm is read? And could you remind us of the title of your book, please? Okay, the book is called Song of Exile. Song of Exile, it's an Oxford University Press publication. Yeah, the psalm that's a good question. I forget the specifics in the Orthodox Judaism. I believe it's used on a sort of rotation where it will come up for graces at meals periodically, along with other psalms. But I should say also that psalm in the exile is really marked during a Jewish holiday called Tisha B'Av, a very somber holiday which takes place in the summer, which is all about remembering exile, persecution, anti-Semitism throughout history. And so this is a time when this psalm is sort of reflected on as capturing a sense of
the Hebrew people that continues to this day, that this sense of being displaced and under threat.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're
Well,
welcome.
with that, I think I'd like to thank David again for his very interesting and enlightening talk. It opened up a new space for me anyway, of reading that psalm, and then also, as I said earlier, seeing all the different ways that it's been interpreted. And that's just really, really interesting. And I appreciate just the breadth of topics that we're seeing here today. They're covering so many different spaces, and that's just, it shows the breadth of expertise that we have in the college. And as I think you were saying earlier, we don't get to hear each other's work enough, and this is a way that allows us to do that. And so thank you again. We'll move on to our next speaker. And I will also have to say that I will have to unfortunately take my leave of this event after this, because I have a pre-existing engagement. So I do want to thank the subcommittee for asking me to help host this. This just has been wonderful, and I really am sorry that I have to go early. But I do want to absolutely introduce our next speaker, Candace Keller, who is speaking on, her title is called Archive of Malian Photography, Supporting the Preservation and Accessibility of Photographic Archives in Mali, West Africa. And Candace earned an MA and PhD degrees from the Department of History and Art at Indiana University in Bloomington. Her work is driven by a commitment to intellectual and cultural diversity. She strives to bring African cultural practices and theoretical perspectives to the conceptual awareness of global audiences, emphasizing their critical value within our increasingly interconnected and transcultural world. With a specific focus on vernacular art and photography, her work centers on the power of representation. She investigates the ways in which cultural knowledge and markers of social identity are constructed, perpetuated, and contested via visual language systems. In this vein, she considers how individuals, artists, patrons, and audiences ascribe meaning to images as they traverse cultural contexts, cultivating a sense of social belonging, individuality, or exclusivity to appreciate how local means of visual expression can have far-reaching significance for global citizens. Her research and courses center on issues of identity, personhood, and complex agency, as well as processes of transculturation, globalization, nationalism, and post-colonialism. Dr. Keller is director of the Archive of Malian Photography and associate director of Matrix, the Center for Digital Humanities and Social Sciences. And her research on the histories of photography in Mali, West Africa, has appeared in several publications, invited lectures and conference presentations, and has been generously supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the British Library. So please, Candace.
Thank you, Sonja, for that introduction, and thank you, Rob, and the committee for the invitation to speak about this project, the Archive of Malian Photography, today, that I've been directing for the past 10 years in collaboration with partners in Mali and a team at Matrix at MSU. I'm gonna go ahead and try to share my screen at the moment. So I've appreciated, as my peers have mentioned, learning from all of my colleagues. So thank you again for the invitation. And I'm excited to be here to talk to you about the Archive of Malian Photography today. It's a project, as I said, that's been going on for about 10 years, first supported by the British Library Endangered Archives Program, and then by the National Endowment for the Humanities Preservation and Access Division. And the goals of the project have been to preserve, digitize, catalog, and render accessible to public audiences more than 128,000 negatives from the archives of 5 professional photographers working in Mali, including Mamadou Cissé, Adama Kouyaté, Abdraman Sakali, Malik Sidibe, and Tijani Shitu. We've added more. They're not on the website yet, so we'll keep adding to this project over time. But the photographers who are featured at the moment, their photographs cover a span of time from around the late 1940s and 1950 up until the 1990s. And they include photographs of rural life and festivals, of political occurrences, the visits of dignitaries. Several of the photographers worked both for the colonial government and military, as well as the national government and military. They include images of voting and marriage ceremonies, parties of youths and other events, identification photography, photography documenting development projects, and then also studio photography. So their collections are politically, socially, culturally, historically significant, as well as in the context of portraiture, particularly, these images picture individuals as they wished to be seen and remembered, which often complicate and challenge prevalent Western narratives and ideas about Africa and Africans, as Professor Choti was mentioning earlier in the day. And so they challenge, culturally biased and stereotyped imagery, which is important as well. So my work, as Dr. Fritzsche was mentioning, has focused on the histories of photographic practice in Mali from the 1880s to the present. And so as I was conducting research for my book, Imaging Culture, I ended up, when I first arrived in 2002, I started working, the first photographer that I met was Malik Sidibé, who's probably the most internationally renowned, along with Seydou Keita, photographers from Mali. And when I arrived in 2002, Seydou Keita had passed away the year before, so I wasn't able to speak with him, although I was able to work with his family. And so and Malik Sidibé is probably the most accoladed or awarded photographer as well from Mali, and arguably from Africa. He was the first to win the Hasselblad Award for Lifetime Achievement in Photography in 2003, the Golden Lion Venice Biennale Award for Lifetime Achievement in 2007, and several awards since. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2016. But so for my research, I started working with Malik Sidibé most closely, and then his peers, so elder photographers in the capital city of Bamako, and then following their professional networks that led me to Ségou, Mopti, Timbuktu, Gao, and back. So working with many different generations of photographers, all the way to the most recent, including women photographers. And in the process of working with, let's say, over 120 different photographers, spending time in their studios, looking at their collections and interviewing them, a lot of issues, ethical issues, concerns about the collections were raised. And I was hearing the same kind of concerns from all of these different places and all these different individuals during the process. And one of the primary concerns for the photographers, if they're still alive, and for their families, who are the custodians of their studio archives, if they're not, was the preservation and the protection of the physical archives themselves. And I'm going to show you some images of the various conditions in which they were housed and organized. And so I'm showing you Tijani Shitu's archives on the left and Malik Sidibé's on the right, and they aren't always stored in archival safe materials, with the climactic challenges of, in the hot season, it can get to 128 degrees, humidity, dust with the harmattan. The physical integrity of the images was in jeopardy. This is Abdurrahman Sakali's archive that was in the attic of his son's house. So part of what our project worked to do with these families and these photographers is address, some of these primary concerns. So reorganizing the archives, keeping them in the same order that the photographers themselves kept them in, which is usually by year, by month, and sometimes by the name of the client or the event. And then cleaning and rehousing them in archival safe materials, envelopes, and boxes. And we worked with a photo conservator from San Francisco, Haida Shoemaker, that trained us in best practices for cleaning and preservation. And so I'm showing you some pictures of our workshop in Bamako. And then along with that, the cataloging and metadata, both for the physical archives, but also for the digital, because part of this process included the digitization, which I'll talk about in a second. To make sure that we had the best knowledge and buy-in, from all of these different constituents and stakeholders, a representative from each archive worked on the cleaning and digitization and preservation processes. And usually this would be one of the sons of the photographer who worked as an apprentice. And so knew the collection best, knew the way that the photographer worked, understood the historical context, the cultural context, and so could best input metadata that corresponded with the particular image. And then they partnered with a graduate student who was studying photography at the Center for Photography in Bamako, in the capital. And I'll talk a little bit about capacity building and sustainability as a part of this project too. But so there were two individuals working together on each of these archives. And we processed about 25,000 negatives per archive a year. And another concern, in addition to the preservation and protection of the physical archives, is the global accessibility to education and awareness about these collections. And part of that stems from the movement of these archives into international art contexts in the 1990s. And most of the narrative kind of focusing in on these two photographers, Seydou Keita and Malik Sidibé, Seydou Keita being presented as the father of portrait photography in Mali, and even Africa more broadly, which of course there were photographers, African photographers or photographers of African heritage practicing as early as the 1850s on the coast of Africa. So, to make such claims about individuals is not quite accurate. And then Malik Sidibé, to create sort of niche markets for these individuals, was presented as the party photographer, when this is not necessarily the roles that they played locally, why they were locally renowned and important, and not necessarily historically allowing for more nuance for the relationship with these other photographers, or allowing for these other photographers to enter into global knowledge and canons of photography. And so this is something that's important to these custodians and the photographers if they're still alive. And so to assist with this concern is the digitization process. So again, scanning the negatives and then creating an online digital repository that is accessible through this website that Matrix, the team at Matrix developed. And so this way it's accessible all around the world, free of charge for people who have access to the internet. And I'll talk about this in a second as well. And then the third primary concern is the protection from theft and exploitation. Because, as I mentioned, when these collections moved into international contexts as artworks in exhibitions, in catalogs, some unscrupulous dealers, collectors, scholars, and even graduate students would come to Mali and other places and argue that they were interested in the collection, that they wanted to have an exhibition and raise the profile of that photographer outside of Mali, but that there weren't the technical means to print large scale, which would be requisite for these exhibitions in Mali, so that they needed to borrow the negatives and take them abroad and print them, curate the exhibitions, at which point the family would be invited and that the negatives would be returned. But there are many cases, and there are some cases where that did happen, but there are many cases where it didn't. And so the exhibitions took place, catalogs were created, articles were published without permission in even African Arts Journal, which is the leading journal in my field. And calendars were made, prints have been sold, and the families were not made aware, and they were not compensated. And when they learned about these events and filed lawsuits locally, often, they can't leave Mali to pursue these abroad. And so there are ongoing lawsuits, but they have still not been able to repatriate, or the negatives have not been restituted in many cases, such as this one, where they're still available for an exhibition or to buy a picture, even though there's a lawsuit against this particular individual. So there is a concern about protecting both the physical archives in the country, but then also when it goes digital, how can we protect the images from being exploited? And so in this interest, one of the main things that we did was that the archives never leave Mali. So we set up a headquarters in Bamako, and the families came together to figure out where would be a trusted location, who would we entrust with the collections while the work was being undertaken. We've already identified the individuals we trust, but what about the institution and the space? And so Yusuf Sakali, pictured here, who's the son of Abdurrahman Sakali, the custodian of his father's archives, was chosen. And he has an IT business that he runs in Bamako. And so he dedicated 2 rooms in his office building to this project. And so this is an image of a workshop training session that was held in Bamako in 2014. And so this is the workspace, and it's still ongoing today, even though the funding from the NEH ended in 2017, which I'd be glad to talk about later. And so in addition to keeping the negatives, the archives in country, we had to, again, address the digital side. And so high resolution TIFFs are maintained by the private archives in Mali, and then also by matrix in perpetuity and cold storage. And then low resolution files at 72 DPI, the JPEGs, are available online for research and learning, but not exploitable in the sense that you couldn't print them out and have high enough quality to sell them or have an exhibition, or even print them in a publication. So you would need to get the proper permission to access the TIFF files. Again, because not everyone has access to the internet, particularly in Mali or in the capital city, Bamako, it was important that we deposited a low resolution collection that could be accessible for research and learning. And we had to figure out, again, what would be the right institution, where would the custodians of the archives feel most comfortable. There's also some mistrust with local institutions and the leaders of them who've participated in this exploitative external market. And so the Maison Africaine de la Photographie, or MAP, was selected mostly because the person who headed it, Moussa Konate, is a scholar, anthropologist, and they have good relationship with him, and that the Rencontre, which is the photo biennial that was started in 1994, the Maison Africaine de la Photographie, or MAP, was part of that. It was an offshoot of that, designed to be a museum, a study space, a workspace, a workshop area for photographers, especially young photographers in Mali. And so it was a place that was kind of trusted and considered important. And anyone who wants to learn about photography or engage in contemporary practice of photography professionally tends to go to MAP. And so we deposited a computer there with the low resolution files so that it's accessible without the internet if necessary. And then the issue of copyright, which in Mali, like in the United States, the professional photographer owns the rights to the negative, and the patron, in the case of portraiture, would own the print. And so to ensure copyright and permissions, we have a couple of different licenses. The low resolution files and the accompanying metadata are protected under the non-commercial Creative Commons International license, which means that they're able to be used without additional permission for education and for scholarship. So for a presentation like this, or for teaching in a classroom, that would be fine. But if you wanted to publish a book or a journal or something, that you would need to get additional permission to access the TIFF files. And so we tried to make everything as transparent as possible also on the website. So all of our policies, procedures, agreements, video of all of our training, our workflows, we post everything online. Also because a lot of people have come to us for mentoring, and we've held workshops to help other communities in Ivory Coast, Burkina Faso, Guinea conduct similar projects. So we're trying to make everything as transparent and public and accessible as possible, so more people, if they're interested, have these resources available to them. And then capacity building is an important part of the project. And that was important to the families too. And so that's why that we decided to work with graduate students at the Center for Photographic Training in Bamako. And this way they're becoming acquainted with these older collections of photography and practices of photography, and speaking with, kind of networking with older generations, developing, a sense of appreciation for that history and an understanding and knowledge of it, which Musa Kalabo, who's pictured here, has spoken often about the value of that, in addition to technical training in various software programs and best practices in cleaning and preservation, which he's using in his own work. And he's becoming an up-and-coming internationally celebrated photographer in his own right. He's won several awards, including at the Rencontre, the Biennale in Bamako, and he's currently on a residency in Paris. And then also with undergraduate students at ENSUP, the École Normale Supérieure in Bamako, who are training to be English teachers. And so it's a dual language database at the moment. It's in French and in English, and you can translate it into other languages with Google Translate, which is of course not a perfect system. And so we're hoping to expand into other languages as well. But right now, because it's in French and English, the original metadata is entered by the team in French, and then the NSIP students translate the French into English. And then at MSU, there's also opportunities for capacity building, and all of these students are paid for their labor, and we write letters of recommendation for them, and it's helped many of them get jobs at the embassy, in professional fields, both in Mali, and also get jobs in the United States, especially for MSU students. So both graduate and undergraduate students at MSU have worked at Matrix on this project. You can see the number over the years who've worked on it. And these include people majoring in French, and they kind of clean up the French and English and follow the list of terms that we've established to be standardized. And then students of photography work on post-processing or post-editing the JPEGs, because a raw scan does not accurately represent the aesthetic intent of the original. So they've been trained for how to adjust the contrast level, basically really conservative adjustments to better represent the aesthetics in the website access images. So the protection of the physical archives, global accessibility and education, protection from theft and exploitation, and capacity building and sustainability have been the cornerstones of the project, informing everything that we've done and are doing moving forward. In 2017, the project was launched in Bamako at the National Museum. There was and this was put on by the team in Bamako. Yusuf Sakali curated the exhibition with the other families, selecting which images they wanted to represent from their father in most cases, because they are often the son. And there was a press conference, so news media from local outlets as well as European ones were present. The Minister of Culture from Mali, Njai Ramatoulaye Diallo, and the US Ambassador to Mali, Paul Folmsby, both spoke at the event, attended the event. It was well attended and considered successful. There was a video that was made partially by US Embassy videographers and also MSU editing and videographers. You can find that on my website today. It used to be available through MSU. I don't know if it still is. And then we had the launch also at MSU at the MSU Museum. So the launch in Mali was in May 2017. In October 2017, we launched at MSU and brought Yusuf Sakali to campus. We had a panel discussion with Kathleen Foley, who's the project manager at Matrix, Yusuf Sakali, the project manager in Bamako, and myself, the director of the project. And then it's gone on to be presented at the biennial, the photography biennial that I mentioned, the Rencontre in Bamako in 2019, where Yusuf Sakali presented. We were invited to present and Yusuf Sakali presented on it, and again held several workshops for teams in neighboring countries who were interested in doing this work, primarily Francophone neighboring countries. And then we are now partnering with a collection in Ghana and working with colleagues in Senegal and Ivory Coast to expand this beyond Mali to overarchingly, ultimately, hopefully create an archive for West African photography to reconnect the dots and the ways in which, people moved through these spaces and photographers also traveled, and, it's not like they're confined by geographical or national borders. And the effects of the project, we had ideas about how we thought people might use the archive, and that's been the case, but there's also been a lot of new things. So we've gotten many requests from, like, the New York Times has used the images in their articles. It's been on the cover of a few scholarly journals, in scholarly articles on women in Africa. It's been in exhibitions in New York and in Morocco. And most recently, partially because of the political instability in Mali right now since the coup, but it's a long story, in 2012. And then also the context of COVID, which makes travel more difficult. A graduate student, Hannah Morris at Columbia University, was able to write her dissertation on Abdurrahman Sakali and his work because we have over 45,000 negatives of his collection available. And also we were able to help facilitate Zoom interviews with the Sakali family, his assistant Amadou Baba Cissé. So it's been able to serve scholarship and education in a variety of ways that we also did not anticipate.
Hi, Candace. This is Rob. I think we're going to have to wrap up really quickly.
Okay, sure. I'm done. Thank you.
No, don't.
I could talk about more that we're doing now, but really that's the project.
Oh, okay. But there is one question for you before we have to go on to the next panelists. And it was what I wanted to know as well. What were you about to say about the NEH funding? Because there seemed to be quite a story there.
I don't know. Well, I guess the story with both sets of funding is that you have to negotiate the values and the goals and the needs of the partners, as well as the stipulations of the funding organization and their, in the case of the British Library, their funding board. And so in the case of the British Library, they only funded pre-modern programs, which is interesting because they cover photography, which is often, by definition considered modern. So we had to argue for why this would fall within their purview. And with the NEH, they had never done a project like this in Africa. And so it was a big risk for them. But now they've done a few, and we're in conversation with them about another project in Africa. So we've benefited well from our relationships with both institutions. I'll stop there.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. It's amazing work.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. We're moving on to the part of our program that's called the Cal Student Spotlight, and we've invited a graduate student and an undergraduate student. The graduate student is Jennifer Junkermeyer-Kahn. She's an MA student in the Arts and Cultural Management and Museum Studies program. It's a new program at Cal, relatively new, so we thought you might want to hear about how that program is working. And Jason Durnay, who is a Bachelor of Fine Arts actor in theater. We'll start with Jennifer first, who has a presentation, I believe, for us.
Yes, let me just share my screen. Okay, let me go to. Okay, great. Okay, hello. My name is Jennifer Junkermeyer-Kahn. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am a first-year master's student in the Arts and Cultural Management and Museum Studies program here at MSU, as Rob mentioned. I'm also pursuing a graduate certificate in Indigenous Studies while I'm here, which is another incredible program that MSU offers. I'm also the department representative on the full council of COGS, which is the Council of Graduate Students at MSU. Additionally, I have a graduate assistantship through the university this year, and I'm working at the MSU Broad Art Museum. So just really quickly, I wanted to, before I get into talking a little bit about the program, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about myself sort of before I got to MSU. So I actually grew up in Minnesota in the suburbs of Minneapolis-St. Paul. I left there to go do my undergraduate studies in New York City at the School of Visual Arts, where I received a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree. I was in New York City from 1999 until 2011. And while I was there, I started working both in nonprofit and commercial art galleries and began to develop a curatorial practice that focused on organizing exhibitions of contemporary art. In 2012, I relocated to Southeast Michigan, first to Ann Arbor and then to Detroit, where I'm currently based. Since being in Michigan, I've continued curating exhibitions and public programs of contemporary art. I also co-founded Infinite Mile, which is an online journal for arts and cultures in Detroit that was active from 2013 to 2017. And since 2017, I've been working as an outreach and public engagement coordinator at a nonprofit art organization in Southeast Michigan, which brings us up to today and my beginning the master's program, which I started this fall. So I'm quite new to the Arts and Cultural Management program, Arts and Cultural Management and Museum Studies program. So I thought maybe the best way for me to introduce the program was just to talk a little bit about the classes that I'm taking this semester, and I am taking 3 classes this semester. And then just to point out the photograph in this picture, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, it's the Louvre in Paris, France. So the first class that I'm taking is Foundations of Museum Studies, which is taught by Arts and Cultural Management Museum Studies Graduate Program Director, Dr. Kirsten Latham. This class delves into the activities, functions, and organization of museums and looks at the changing role of museums as cultural institutions. This is a photograph of one of our textbooks that we're using that was co-written by Dr. Latham and is just one of the many texts that we're using in the class. And then we actually have 2 final projects that we're working on for Foundations of Museum Studies. The first is a research paper, which we were able to select the topic for. My research paper is focused on sort of answering questions around the implementation of inclusivity, diversity, equity, and access initiatives at museums. And our second final project for this class is the Museum Definition Project, which is actually based on a current debate taking place in the global museum community, specifically at the International Council of Museums, which is called ICOM. And ICOM is actually in the process right now of coming up with a new definition of what a museum is. And so within the class, we're also doing something similar. Pictured here, I just have a the article from the New York Times, which kind of describes that current debate and what's happening there. My next course is the Introduction to Arts and Cultural Management, which really delves into the ins and outs of the arts and cultural organization, its artistic administration and executive management. In this course, we're looking at operations and procedures of art and humanities-based agencies, including funding and financial structures, audience development, and marketing, among other things. Again, this is another textbook that we use for the class, just one of many texts. And the third class I'm taking this semester is the Nonprofit Law for Arts and Cultural Management. And this course gets into the legal issues pertaining to the creation and operation of cultural business entities, including nonprofit organizations. It explores aspects of nonprofit and business law, finances and taxes, contracts, intellectual property, constitutional law, artists' moral and economic rights, and estate planning for individuals and organizations. And again, this is just one of the many texts that we're using in the class. And then the final project that we have for both the Introduction to Arts and Cultural Management course and the Nonprofit Law for Arts and Cultural Management course is to create an arts organization, to create our own arts organization. And so for each class, we're kind of taking on different parts of what that is. So for the intro class, we need to come up with the organization name, the mission and statement, a structural organizational chart, which lists all the staff in detail and gives a brief descriptions of what they do. We have to design a donor program. We have to describe how we're going to engage with the community, talk about our brand, and really sort of flesh that out about what that can be. And then for the Nonprofit Law for Arts and Cultural Management final project, we have to draft bylaws, we have to draft Form 1023 for this organization, as well as draft an initial solicitation form for the Attorney General's office. And then this is just a photograph, or actually a logo that I'm working on for my arts organization, which is going to be called Project, which is kind of looking at, it's still being developed right now, but it's really looking at the intersections of technology, art, and community. So that's where I will leave it. Great, thank you.
Hey, thanks. Maybe we'll save questions for after we talk with Jason, and then we can do both of those. Would that sound okay? Great. So Jason is a senior BFA actor in the Department of Theater. You're very interested in voice acting. Can you tell us what that is?
Sure. So voice acting is a wide-ranging industry consisting of everything from commercial voiceover, so the people here talking about Chevy trucks, to narration for audiobooks. Sometimes it works with blind assistants. Sometimes it works with everything from animation to talking about, like I said, commercial voiceover. So it's kind of the wide-ranging aspects of people who use their voice to record mediums of performance.
Cool. So, and you recently received from the Dean's Arts Advisory Council and many other departments across the campus, a COVID Create mini grant. Can you talk about that program and then what your project was?
Absolutely. So along with me and my partner, Nate Davis, we created a limited run podcast series based off of these COVID grants, which was designed to showcase artwork under the pandemic. And what we decided to do was specifically interview professional working artists across the country in different fields and different career pathways. So everything from graphic designers, actors, to directors and stage managers, arts educators, and kind of see how they're coping and how they're working under the current pandemic conditions. We created, I believe, 10 episodes. Those are all currently available publicly. And we wanted to get to the heart of how art kind of changes and adapts to the time, not how it's struggling, but how it's thriving and how people are always finding a way to create what they want to create.
That's really interesting. Can you talk about maybe the thing that you learned about that from the people you interviewed, the most interesting thing?
Absolutely. What I thought was most interesting was seeing the change between embracing change and difference rather than seeing it as a limiting obstacle. So for example, most podcasts are often recorded in person in a soundproof room to ensure optimal audio quality. But now there is completely digital options such as Zencastr, where you can podcast completely digitally. You can do it over Zoom. There's an option to record individually for that. And a lot of artists started to approach things as not the pandemic is holding me back, but here is a new way where we can try and create new art and not necessarily pursue that in the future, but see how it develops over time and really embrace the fact that this is a career, this is not something that's going away, and people always have a demand for their services. So how does that change during a pandemic?
That's really interesting. Also, I'm wondering about, you're about to enter the market where there is no market currently. All right, you're about to graduate in a very uncertain field. I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about that?
It's, of course, always changing, just taking it day by day. You'd asked about voice acting earlier. Strangely enough, voice acting has become the vast majority of the performance industry during this time because it can be done remotely. It's been done remotely for many, many years now, and it's relatively easy to do safely. So commercials have been being produced with relative frequency and ease. So animation projects can be done from home. Most artists have their own studios, so it's something that's able to work with. So I'm a little bit more confident in that aspect, but in live performance, which is something I enjoy, such as with the Department of Theater, I'm always a little bit worried, but I'm glad that the community is always taking its first steps. And I'm always looking forward to what's next. So since we're having to wait so long, what will be coming out of this period when everybody has a renewed fervor for coming to see arts in person? What exactly will that look like, and how will people respond to the new challenges? Because it's not going to be suddenly all at once everything is okay. So how will be that gradual stepping process, and how far is enough at one time?
That's awesome. So people ask me all the time, and I thought maybe it would be great to hear it from you. How can you teach theater online? How can you take acting online? Let's talk about your experience having all online courses in performance-based classes.
So as I said earlier, it's kind of that shift of this is preventing me and embracing this is what it is. So for example, it's very easy to do a scene in person with somebody. You can act back and forth. It's easier to read their body language. There's less of a delay of communication. And it's something that I'm very used to. Acting to a camera with another person is something that a lot of people in the department aren't very familiar with, or can be difficult at times because it's hard to get a reaction. Sometimes it's hard to focus, tell body language. But the fact of the matter is, doing self-tapes for auditions, recording to a camera, recording without a set is something that has become increasingly standard, and regardless of the pandemic. So looking at it from that angle, if I'm getting experience of acting just by myself, I'm getting experience of recording self-tapes, editing experience, and embracing the ideas of different performance mediums. So even though I'm not doing a live theatrical show, I'm currently working with Dr. Derek McNish on an audio anthology, which is a different form of presentation. And embracing that has been somewhat challenging at times because I'd much rather prefer to be doing it in person and taking these performance classes, but enjoying the challenge and looking at it as something new to learn has been what I've been focusing on.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's sometimes a trade-off of intimacy, right? Remember when we were doing those scenes last spring in terms of Uncle Vanya, those scenes, and actually kind of the connection that you can get over a scene, sometimes be even more intimate. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. Like you said, with those Uncle Vanya scenes, I worked with Matthew Kowalczyk, and we spent a lot of time working on how does that complete distance change to complete intimacy? Because instead of this world we're living in, it's just two people in that place, we have each other on the screen, and I have to focus my direct attention at them. I'm alone with them in this world, and it really helped us narrow in of having that very, very close and personal, almost they're in my house, I'm in their house, and being able to express that, because there's always been talks about how social media is either dividing or bringing together humanity. And this is a very similar aspect. It's very intimate to be in person. It's something we're used to, but where does the intimacy find itself when over a digital screen, we're able to communicate with one another and see very close up how their face looks, the place that they're living in, where they're coming from, and that their entire attention is focused on that person.
Yeah, you also have another major, do you not?
I do. I'm also a double major in management in the College of Business.
And how do you see those two careers connecting?
So they, of course, have crossovers between self-advocacy and working as independent contractors and artists. That's something that I'll have to do a lot in the future. And working in the business side of it, ideas like marketing, advertising, and human relations are often somewhat more creative and broad than people would like to admit. They like to rely on hard sciences a lot of the time, talking about, employee turnover and working with relations, productivity, but understanding humanity and understanding how to effectively create, creatively work, creatively problem solve, be able to connect with one another, being able to understand how you work personally has been a great influence in my business career as well.
You recently, in the class that we're in together, you had to do a sketch comedy assignment and work in groups and film in groups. And how did you do that while remaining safe?
So most of ours was recorded individually, and we used editing software to make it seem like we are together in some manner, such as going to the same location and taking all of my recordings, and then the other person going a different day and doing recordings in that exact same space. Sometimes that's a way you can kind of cheat the system because you might be able to establish the location. We had some fun with doing distance shots because we had outdoor shots that we were 6 feet apart, and that was able to be done safely. But we really had fun enjoying the challenge of writing from a distance, because whenever people are trying to create or pitch ideas, there's a lot of what ifs, a lot of suggestions, a lot of like very quick ideas. And with like a quarter of a second delay, everybody's talking over one another. It was a little bit fun to get over. But ultimately, working with the other students, we were able to have a process figured out. Once we were able to establish kind of a method of communication, being able to talk with one another, it ultimately, I think, worked out rather well, and we were able to create something of its time. And I think that it would even be able to exist outside of its time and be seen as something standing on its own.
I agree with you. Let's open it up now to questions for both of our students, both Jennifer and Jason. Does anyone have any questions about the MA program, museum studies, or theater, or about what it's like to be a student right now? Or I'll ask some questions then until we get some. Jennifer, are your classes all online?
No, actually. So one of my classes is entirely online. The other two are actually hybrid classes. So we have had in-person classes, which is just recently kind of ended. So now the two hybrid classes will go online. But yeah, so I was still going in a little bit, but I actually don't mind being online. I don't mind the Zoom format. So I might be in the minority there, but I've been enjoying it.
Yeah, I often say that as an introvert, I really enjoy this whole Zooming thing. It's really great. Jason, what about for you? Have you experienced Zoom fatigue in your classes?
A little bit. It's somewhat harder to rationalize getting out of bed early in the morning and then walking 2 feet to go to class instead of having, the hour to prep yourself, get to class. That's a little bit harder, but I've been embracing it sometimes as well. The ability to turn off my camera, focus on myself, and take notes, make myself comfortable at home. Sometimes multitask both with things that I'm doing in my personal life and with my schoolwork has been unparalleled in its ability. And being able to just create my own space. So I'm creating a recording studio in my own apartment, being able to focus on a very easy system of writing down my tasks has been useful, and not having to transport on the next place to the next place to the next place. It's actually made me a little bit less busy, which has been kind of a relief my senior year.
Jennifer, where do you see yourself after graduation?
That's a good question. I think part of the reason that I wanted to pursue a master's degree is because I wanted to be able to keep moving up in my field and hopefully into a leadership position. So that's kind of where I'm envisioning where I will end up. But yeah, I guess we will see.
It's all very tentative, right? Yeah. Awesome. Well, we want to thank you so much for joining us today and sharing all of your work. And we hope to hear more from you soon.
Thank you so much for having us.
Great. So that brings us to the end of our Classes with Cal event. As I said earlier, it was sponsored by the Culture of Care Retirement Subcommittee. And so if some of our members are here, I thought they might like to talk about some of the work that we've been doing and kind of asking for our audience members, some of our audience members, if they have ideas or ways to engage and connect with retirees. We're going to be sending out a survey, but if there's anybody that has some ideas now that might like to share them, or if any of the committee members want to talk about some of the work that we've been doing, I'd love to welcome anyone to do that now.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending. I think we would, as a committee, be very interested to hear your reaction and what other programs like this in terms of format, speakers, etc. I mean, for myself, I loved hearing what other faculty members are working on. And as David said, it's not, you don't have an opportunity to do that frequently. So I've learned a lot. But how do we increase audience, or is it format? Is it time of day? Of course, we're competing with a beautiful day out, so that doesn't help. But I think we are looking forward to feedback either now or later on.
I guess we can, we'll be sending out a survey and we'll be soliciting your advice for future events like this or other ideas that you might have. We just want to make sure that we understand, that you understand that we respect your past work here in Cal, and we want to make sure that we stay engaged with you. Oh, someone has an idea, philosophy as it relates to environmental topics, e.g. climate change. Yeah, we talked about doing a sort of themed talk, but we didn't know if that would be too limiting, but I think we could certainly, if people thought that was interesting in the future, we could examine that. All right, well, we thank you for your time today, and we'll look forward to hearing from us in terms of a survey or some soliciting some suggestions from you. Go out and enjoy the weather. Thank you so much.